Hey all, here OS Reviews. You're watching our throwback review of the Nextbit Robin in 2019. This was a phone that was released in early 2016, so it's barely 3 years old, but the company has already gone defunct since been acquired by Razer, and Razer has released two handsets which have very similar design language to the Nextbit Robin, have a very boxy shape, kind of like a Sony Ericsson phone, however with upgraded internals. But anyways, what makes this phone unique was it was a crowdsourced Kickstarter campaign, so it was by a very new company, and B, it was the first cloud phone. What that meant was you could download applications, and after it wasn't used for a while, Nextbit would automatically send them to its own servers, so send it to the cloud and free up space on your device for you to download more content that you actually would use. So essentially it's 100 gigabytes of free cloud storage with the purchase of the phone, in addition to 32 gigs of built-in storage for a combined total of 132 gigs, more than its competition at the same price point. Back in this day, this was really meant as a mid-end phone. It was priced at around $300, but now you can find it on Amazon or eBay for well under $100. So let's find out if this is still a worthwhile phone to consider if you're looking for a budget-oriented Android phone that's unlocked. So the packaging here is very unique. We have the cloud logo. We have kind of a book-like packaging that's very narrow. You can open up. It says, "Hey Rebel, meet Robin." And we also have some quick instructions on the sides about how to pop in the SIM card and to access the fingerprint scanner, which is rear-mounted, just like on a Sony Ericsson phone. Over the phone here, we have another pamphlet that says, "Next Now, Be Heard." That's kind of the social media channels that Nextbit were available on. Unfortunately, again, since Nextbit have been acquired, the servers and the whole cloud thing has gone belly up as well. So by now, users can no longer access that 100 gigs of storage. So it's basically just like any other Android phone by now. The cloud services are basically dead. Hardware design of the Nextbit Robin is definitely very interesting looking. This is the mint color, which is close to a cyan blue, and it's definitely very colorful looking, almost reminiscent in terms of how playful it is of Nokia's Lumia's phones back in the day. The device is made entirely out of polycarbonate plastic, which is a departure from the glass and aluminum of more modern phones, but I'm actually not mad about it because it gives it slightly more durability. If you accidentally drop it, there's a good shock absorbency, and of course it has a very colorful, eye-catching vibe that will definitely turn heads, and people will ask you, hey, what phone are you using when you use it out in public? Now on the front we have access to actually stereo speakers, so sound quality was actually pretty good on the Nextbit Robin. I'll talk about that more in a demo later on in this video, but we have these two little dimples which are the speakers, doubling as a microphone and the headset piece. We also have a front-facing camera and a proximity light sensor. On the top there's a standard 3.5mm headphone jack, again very boxy shape, and we also have these two tiny dimples for the volume rocker. Luckily these keys themselves, although very small, are actually quite tactile. They're very responsive and clicky, so they feel pretty good in terms of action. On the bottom you also have access to the USB Type-C port, which also supports Qualcomm's quick charge, which is great to see. There's also NFC, there's GPS, there's Bluetooth, there's Wi-Fi, it supports 4G LTE, so in terms of connectivity, you are pretty much fully stacked. There's also access to the fingerprint scanner, which doubles as a power key. And on the back, you'll find a 13 megapixel camera with a dual-tone LED flash. It's made by Sony, which is a little bit ironic, as well as the cloud logo and 4 small LEDs that used to glow whenever the phone was uploading or downloading content from Nextbit servers. So overall, I still really like the design of the phone. It's quite slim. The only downside is obviously because of the front-facing speakers, which the Razer phone has retained, by the way. It does have pretty large bezels on the top and the bottom, which is different from the trend of 2018 going towards kind of bezel-less and hiding these borders, but overall it still is a very interesting looking phone. Now it does have a full HD resolution, which is plenty bright and sharp, and it's an IPS panel which has pretty good viewing angles, coated and protected by Corning's Gorilla Glass. Running the show is a Hexa-Core processor, the infamous Qualcomm Snapdragon 808. It's the same chipset found on the BlackBerry Priv, on the LG G4, among many other devices which were known to have kind of not super great performance because the CPU thermal throttles, and after it runs hot by opening up a lot of apps, the performance significantly degrades, and you're left with a pretty choppy experience for a flagship processor. With that being said, for light usage, it still is absolutely fine. It's just not the most energy saving or the most powerful CPU as a result. But anyways, we have a very interesting launcher experience that's been customized by Nextbit. Now, the side-mounted fingerprint scanner, I personally don't think is as accurate as a regular scanner. Yes, it works fine if you're putting your entire thumb on it, but if you're trying to scan in parts of a finger, like a smaller index finger holding it at a different position, it often doesn't recognize it. So it's a little bit temperamental. In terms of speed, though, it is fairly fast in terms of unlocking, very similar to other Android phones from 2016. So it's adequate, but not quite as easy to unlock as maybe on the back or on the front. Anyways, getting into this main UI, again, we do have a very interesting look. The wallpapers matches the color of the phone. So we do have a standard Google search bar. We also have our Google apps, which are showing up in a folder that's by default installed, including access to Drive, Photos, NFC, so Google Pay, Play Games, YouTube, Hangouts, and Voice Search. There's also the Play Store on the side there. On the next panel over, we have some utilities, such as a calculator. This is pretty much stock Android, but they've matched the color with the mint on the phone, and settings, which is, again, matching the color of the phone. So a lot of good attention to detail can be found. So first impressions, you can tell how scrolling is actually pretty smooth and responsive. General UI navigation, you won't find any problems at all. So the 808 here still does a decent job. So the icons on the bottom here, you'll find access to just dialer pads or calling people, pretty typical. You also find access to a messaging app, Chrome, and the camera. Now, the thing that's unique here is these three little dots that you can tap on, and this was the widget that you could use to access the cloud services, but again, no longer functional. So you could tap on this to see your archived apps, essentially content that hasn't been used for, let's say, 60 days, has been freed up by moving it into the cloud, and then if the service was still running, you would have been able to tap on it to pull that information back down. So here we have Soundwave and health apps, which are no longer there. Pinned apps are the ones that you can previously save to never be uploaded to the cloud if you always use them. And there's also the ability of all apps that you can tap on to see a complete roster. That's a little bit different than having just a button on the bottom that you can tap on to see a list of all your apps or swiping up. So you have to tap on this little key here to see a list if you want to access this drawer format, which is a little bit unique to this particular launcher. Now, the phone came with Android 6.0 initially, but Nextbit has upgraded it to Android 7.0 Nougat, where it's sitting at currently because, again, no upgrades will be available in the future. But you can see plenty of community forums and people installing their own launchers, rooting the phone to bring it up to newer versions, but you have to do a bit more of work on your side. For instance, we can install Nova Launcher, and that gives us a more stock experience, including this drag-up drawer if you want to use something that's more similar to stock Android as opposed to the Nextbit launcher. So let's take a quick look at the camera experience first. Again, it's 13 megapixels, and it was never really the forte of this phone to begin with. Camera technology has gotten significantly better over the past year and a half. It doesn't do bokeh. It takes a little bit longer to snap an image, and quality of shots are also not super in focus unless you stay super still. It's not the sharpest looking camera in the world, but it's functional. The menu itself is also very colorful, matches the theme of the phone, so it's very consistent, and it is very simple to understand. I can also switch to a manual camera mode if I want to change things like white balance, exposure level, ISO, things like that. And I can record video up to 4K resolution. One nice thing about the cameras would be the front-facing one, which has a wider field of view than most other mid-end phones. In fact, it fits easily 4 or 5 people into one shot just by holding it normally in your hands. Some sample images, this one here was captured using HDR. It brings up a lot of the details in the shadows, and again, it's decent for macro shots. So with that being said, again, edges can still be a little bit on the blurry side. It's not the most crisp looking. And here's the exact same shot captured without HDR. You can see it's a lot darker if I have the light being tapped to focus. So that's kind of the trend of this camera. It performs alright, especially if there's a good amount of light in the background. Again, this is by no means a camera-centric smartphone. The camera is functional, but it really is super average for even a mid-end smartphone. Alright, so other features we can take a look at. Let's jump into video playback and see how it handles. So it actually works really well. The front-facing speakers are definitely better than most smartphones these days, which only have one speaker, which is tucked away on the rear. Of course, it also has a standard headphone jack, which is always great to see, in addition to a Type-C port and Bluetooth. Again, the 808 is actually keeping up really well when it comes to scrubbing between parts of the video, and it's loading back really nicely, even in full HD resolution here. So there's no problems at all in terms of watching media. Potentially the only downside is, again, the screen isn't the most immersive because it does have this black border that is definitely not bezel-less, so it doesn't feel like you're really holding onto content. It still feels like you're holding onto a phone. One other thing I want to point out is that the screen is super sensitive. It definitely feels like a flagship phone in that sense, similar to a Samsung device or an Apple iPhone. It also has a great haptic engine, so whenever you tap on a button, it gives you a vibration like you're tapping on a real key. So the same thing goes when you're trying to type out letters using the virtual keyboard. It just feels very precise, and it feels like you're actually tapping on something real. So let's try doing a quick web browsing test using Chrome. And again, the 808 is still a decent CPU. I would say it's definitely mid-end by today's standards, but it's still perfectly acceptable and going to perform a little bit faster than Snapdragon's 400 series in many cases. And you can tell here that scrolling is still buttery smooth. It's loading back pretty well. If we try to request the desktop version of the New York Times, let's see if it will handle itself well. I have to say that the Wi-Fi reception is also quite good. Being a plastic phone, that's always one of the advantages, is the antennas don't have as much of a problem in terms of passing through the phone's shell. So as a result, you do have pretty fast connectivity to the internet, whether that's Wi-Fi or 4G. And now it's attempting to load back the desktop version of CNET, also doing a pretty good job. You can open up, I would say, a handful, 5 or 6 of these complex sites, and it still juggles them in the RAM pretty easily. Speaking of, the phone has 3 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM. So by 2019 standards, that's definitely budget / mid-end segment, which this phone kind of was to begin with, but it's by no means a flagship device. Again, flagships these days on Android have upwards of 8 gigs of RAM, which is crazy, but again, that does kind of help if you are juggling a ton of different programs in the background. The drag-down notification shade also has the same colors and accents as the phone. Now, speaking of, the battery of this particular phone is okay. It's not amazing. In fact, it's one of the weakest aspects. The capacity is rated at 2,680 milliamp hours, which is definitely on the small side for a phone that has, again, a form factor that's quite similar to a phablet, in fact, a 5.5-inch device almost because of the larger bezels. So that's one area of potential concern. Is it will definitely last you through an entire day, but it for sure needs to be charged up pretty frequently. So if endurance is your #1 priority, there are better options to consider. 32 gigs is fixed. It doesn't have a microSD card to expand on the built-in memory because the whole premise of the phone was that cloud integration, which again has been killed off. And as such, you are left with the 32 gigabytes. It's still fine for, I think, users who aren't super demanding and have their entire media collection on their device. Other areas of the phone, including making phone calls, works really nicely, both on AT&T and T-Mobile when I tested it, and the microphone sounded loud and clear. Same thing goes with the speakerphone with these stereo speakers. Otherwise, for gaming, as I touched upon, it works well enough for most titles. Even heavier ones like Asphalt 9 will still run. Granted, you should close down some of the other apps in the background before doing it, and it actually is still quite a snappy experience. I would say that after 30 minutes of use, if you're using the camera or using a heavy game, the device does get slightly warm on the back, but otherwise it still performs again pretty well. So overall, would I recommend this device here in 2019? I would say probably yes. If you're looking for a device that gets all the essentials right when it comes to media playback, as well as a very smooth experience thanks to a great haptic engine and a great touchscreen, you aren't looking for the most cutting-edge device, but you want something unique that will turn heads and perform solidly for basic tasks like watching videos, doing a little bit of gaming and some web browsing, it still is a pretty good value at under $100 now. You can find it as low as $75 currently in like-new condition. However, if you want the phone with the longest endurance in terms of battery life and the largest screen-to-body ratio, this is not going to be it for you. But it definitely will allow you to stand out among a sea of very similar phones with its unique color scheme and nice attention to detail with the software. So despite the fact that the cloud services no longer exist, I still think it's a solid budget phone now at its current price. So you can check out more details in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been our revisited look at the Nextbit Robin.